The summer heat in Abilene, Texas, was the kind that pressed against a man like a heavy quilt, making every breath feel thick with dust. Daniel Parker trudged along the worn dirt road that led from the county schoolhouse to the edge of town, the cracked leather strap of his satchel digging into his shoulder. Inside were neatly graded essays on the American frontier, his students' tidy handwriting filled with stories of grit and determination, qualities he himself felt slipping through his fingers. At 34, Daniel had been teaching history for nearly a decade. He loved the stories, the lessons of endurance and courage from 100 years before, but his own life had begun to feel like a cautionary tale. His paychecks barely stretched far enough to keep the lights on, and his father's small ranch, the one patch of land Daniel had always hoped to restore, was slipping into the jaws of foreclosure. He carried the bank's final warning letter folded in with those essays, the paper creased and softened from too many moments spent reading it in quiet desperation. Years ago, his father had spoken often of a single dream, owning Daisy, a prize Jersey cow known throughout the county for her rich, golden milk. She was strong, gentle, and the kind of animal that could turn a struggling ranch into a steady livelihood. But Daisy had always been out of their reach, sold instead to a wealthier rancher. Now, even that dream seemed like a cruel ghost. Daniel's herd was gone, the pastures nearly empty, and without a miracle, the ranch would be gone too. His boots were worn through at the heel, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and his future seemed like a dry riverbed, a parched and without promise. On a sweltering Saturday afternoon, he wandered toward the county fair. The Abilene County Fair was the kind of event where everyone showed up, from the wealthiest ranchers in pressed jeans to the smallest children chasing balloons between food stalls. Bright banners snapped in the wind above the rodeo arena, the air thick with the smell of fried dough, smoked brisket, and sawdust. Daniel walked slowly through the fairgrounds, nodding politely at familiar faces as parents of students, fellow townsfolk, but he wasn't there for the rides or the contests. He just needed to be somewhere other than the empty ranch house, somewhere that didn't echo with the sound of his father's absence. It was near the cattle pens that he heard the raised voices. A woman was standing face to face with an older man, her posture rigid, her tone sharp. Daniel paused, drawn by the tension in the air. She was hard to miss, taller than most men in the crowd, broad-shouldered, her jeans tucked neatly into scuffed brown boots. Her plaid shirt was rolled up at the elbows, revealing strong forearms marked by years of labor. A weathered Stetson shaded her face, but her green eyes shone like polished glass. This was Rebecca McGraw, though most folks in 3 counties knew her simply as Becky, the giant cowgirl. She had a reputation on the rodeo circuit as a roper who could take down a steer in record time, and her strength was the stuff of local legend. The man she was arguing with, a stocky, sunburnt, and wearing a hat pushed back on his head, jabbed a calloused finger in her direction. "You're running out of time, Becky. I ain't holding on to this farm forever. You don't have a husband before summer's end. I'm selling the place and Daisy's headed to market. You understand me?" The name hit Daniel like a strike of lightning. Daisy. He searched the pen until he saw her exactly as he remembered from years before. Her golden brown coat gleamed under the afternoon sun, and she chewed her cud calmly, her dark eyes gentle and wise. His father's dream. The one cow he had always wanted for their ranch. And here she was, standing behind the kind of woman who looked like she could wrestle a bull to the ground. Becky's voice cut through his thoughts. "I told you, Uncle Jim, I ain't marrying just to marry. I've built this place with my own 2 hands. I've worked every acre, fixed every fence, hauled every bale. I don't need some man to sign his name to what I already own." Her uncle shook his head. "A name's what the bank wants. They ain't gonna give you leniency otherwise. The law don't care how hard you worked." Daniel lingered, the pull of the conversation rooting him in place. He wasn't the kind of man to butt into other people's business, but the thought of Daisy going to Marketa and the thought of his father's voice saying, "She'd change everything for USA" was enough to push him forward. Clearing his throat, he stepped closer. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, tipping his head politely. Becky's sharp green eyes narrowed at him, and her uncle turned with a look that measured him from boots to hair. "I couldn't help overhearin'," Daniel continued. "Sounds like you're in need of a husband. A broken bar might be able to help with that." Becky crossed her arms. "And who exactly are you?" "Daniel Parker. History teacher. But I was raised on a ranch. I know how to work land and care for cattle. And a broken bar, I could use a good cow. Especially Daisy." A smirk tugged at the corner of her uncle's mouth. "You telling me you'd marry my niece for a cow?" Daniel met his gaze evenly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Around them, a few curious fairgoers had begun to gather, sensing something worth listening to. Some chuckled quietly, others whispered. Becky's expression didn't soften. She studied Daniel like she was weighing a horse she wasn't sure was worth the feat. "I'm not looking for romance, Parker," she said finally. "No love, no flowers, no nonsense. I want to keep my land. You get Daisy, I keep my ranch. We stay out of each other's way. Deal?" It was reckless. It was absurd. And it was the first real opportunity Daniel had seen in years. "Deal," he said without hesitation. Her uncle wasted no time. The county clerk, who was judging pies in a nearby tent, was called over. Standing there under the shade of the cattle tent, with the warm scent of hay all around and the sound of the rodeo announcer in the distance, Daniel and Becky signed the marriage license. The clerk's pen scratched across the paper, and then it was stamped. The murmuring crowd broke into applause and laughter, though more than a few people shook their heads like they just watched a man walk willingly into a storm. By sundown, Daniel was loading Daisy into a borrowed trailer. Her breath was warm on his arm as he secured the gate, her calm presence steadying his nerves. The farmhouse sat at the far end of Becky's property, its white paint weathered, the porch sagging slightly under years of use. Becky leaned against the railing, arms folded, her face unreadable. He drove the trailer down the dusty track toward the barn, the tires crunching over gravel. The land stretched out in every direction, endless and quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the occasional call of a distant crow. When he unloaded Daisy into the barn, he lingered, brushing her coat with slow strokes. "Well, girl," he murmured, "looks like it's you and me now. Let's see if we can make something out of this mess." From the barn door came Becky's voice, low and even. "Guest room's down the hall. Don't expect breakfast. And keep out of my way." Daniel turned toward her, but she was already walking back toward the farmhouse, the screen door creaking as it shut behind her. He heard the faint click of the lock, and the sound seemed to settle over him heavier than the summer heat. He exhaled slowly, looking back at Daisy. Somewhere between the county fair and this quiet barn, his life had changed in a way he couldn't have imagined that morning. Whether it would be for better or worse, he didn't yet know. All he knew was that the papers were signed, the deal was done, and he had just married the tallest, toughest cowgirl in Texas for a cow. The first night of marriage was nothing like the stories Daniel had read in his history books or heard in small-town gossip. After settling Daisy in the barn, he'd walked up to the farmhouse, the smell of wood and sun-dried earth lingering in the air. Becky was already inside, moving with a purposeful efficiency as she kicked off her boots and hung her hat on a peg. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "Guest room's the second door on the left. Bathroom's across the hall. My room's the one at the end, to stay out of it," Daniel stopped in the entryway, the screen door slamming shut behind him. "I wasn't planning on barging in," he said, keeping his tone even. But there was something in the way she avoided his gaze, something in the quiet distance she placed between them, that made him realize this was more than just stubbornness. Becky was a fortress, the walls high, gates locked, watchtowers always manned. By the time he found the guest room, she had already gone down the hall and shut her bedroom door. A moment later, he heard the click of the lock. It was a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have, carrying with it a message he didn't need spelled out. This wasn't a marriage in the romantic sense, it was a business arrangement, and he was only here because of Daisy. Days turned into weeks. Daniel woke early each morning, his body falling into the old rhythm of ranch work before heading into town to teach. He'd milk Daisy in the soft light of dawn, the barn filled with the gentle clink of the pail and the smell of fresh hay. Then he'd drive the dusty miles to the schoolhouse, stand before a classroom of restless students, and talk about the grit it took to survive in the Old West. He sometimes wondered if his lectures were more about history or about trying to convince himself that endurance still mattered. Becky's life ran parallel to his, intersecting only at mealtimes. She worked the land fiercely, amending fences, hauling hay, and keeping the ranch in working order. She didn't ask for help, but Daniel offered when he could, and while she never thanked him outright, she also didn't send him away. They shared dinners in a kitchen that smelled of cornbread and coffee, speaking only when necessary. She was polite, but never warm, her eyes always guarded. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting moments when Daniel caught a glimpse of something softer. Once, he saw her pause to stroke Daisy's neck, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Another time, during a late evening meal, she listened to him tell a story about his students with a quiet interest, though she said nothing when he finished. It was like watching sunlight slip through a crack in the barn wall, there and gone before you could truly feel its warmth. One night, a storm rolled in from the west, black clouds swallowing the last light of day. The wind came first, rattling the windows and groaning through the trees. Then the rain arrived, hammering the tin roof with a force that made conversation impossible. Daniel was halfway through closing the barn doors when a flash of lightning lit up the fields, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The air smelled of ozone, sharp and electric. It was then he saw eye to the sharp streak of fire racing down the old cottonwoods beside the barn. The lightning had split the tree, and the sparks had caught on the dry grass. The wind pushed the flames toward the barn in seconds. Panic surged through him. Inside were Daisy and the rest of Becky's livestock. Without thinking, Daniel threw the doors wide and ran into the shadows. The animals were restless, their cries high and panicked as the scent of smoke thickened. He moved fast, untying ropes, guiding them toward the open pasture where the rain might keep them safe. Daisy balked at the barn door, eyes wide with fear, but he placed a steady hand on her neck, speaking low and calm despite the pounding of his heart. "Come on, girl. We've got to move." She followed him out into the rain, her hooves splashing in the mud as they crossed the yard. When the last of the animals was clear, Daniel turned back to find Becky standing at the edge of the porch, her hat pulled low, her raincoat plastered to her tall frame. She was watching him, not the fire, her eyes fixed on the way he had walked into danger without hesitation. He didn't stop to meet her gaze, he just kept moving, circling back to make sure every stall was empty. The fire sputtered under the heavy downpour, and within minutes, the danger had passed. But the image of Daniel leading Daisy through the storm stayed with Becky long after the flames were gone. The next morning, the air was clear and cool, the fields glistening with dew. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when Becky came in. She moved to the stove without a word, but instead of ignoring him as usual, she placed a plate of scrambled eggs and biscuits in front of him. He raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Breakfast," she said simply, sitting down across from him. For the first time since they'd married, her eyes didn't carry the same guarded distance. They were studying him, like she was seeing something she hadn't before. From that day on, the tone between them began to shift. It wasn't sudden. Becky was still slow to trust, and Daniel was careful not to push all, but the walls around her seemed just a little lower. She let him help with the heavier work on the ranch without protest. Sometimes, she'd even wait for him after school so they could eat dinner together. They began talking not just about chores or the weather, but about real things. She told him about growing up under her uncle's roof, about the years she spent proving herself in rodeos where men tried to ride her off the circuit. He told her about his father, the long summers mending fences, and how teaching was the one thing that had kept him from drowning in debt sooner. One evening, as they were putting tools away in the shed, Becky leaned against the wall, watching him coil a rope. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "How so?" "I figured you'd take Daisy and keep to yourself. Most men would have by now." Daniel met her gaze. "Maybe I was here for Daisy at first. But I'm not blind, Becky. I can see how much you've put into this place. It matters. You matter." Her eyes softened for a heartbeat, then she pushed off the wall and headed for the house, calling over her shoulder, "Don't think that means I'm cooking breakfast every day." That night, after dinner, Daniel walked down the hall to find Becky standing in front of her bedroom door. She hesitated, her hand resting on the knob. When she turned to him, there was something uncharacteristically vulnerable in her face. "Guess it's time you stop being the man who married me for a cow," she said quietly. "And start being the man I actually married." She opened the door, stepping aside. The gesture was small, but in that moment, it felt like the world had shifted. For weeks, the locked door had been a symbol of everything that stood between them: her distrust, his uncertainty, the space that marriage in name only had created. Now, with a single motion, she was letting him in. Daniel crossed the threshold, knowing there was still a long road ahead. Trust wasn't built overnight, and love wasn't born out of convenience. But as the sound of rain began to patter softly against the roof again, he felt something warm settle in his chest. He had come to this ranch for a cow, but he was beginning to understand that what he'd found was worth far more.